So welcome to Library Resources and Services for Increasing Research Impact, which hopefully is a title we can actually deliver on. So I'm Rachel. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Chris Lewis.
Stefan Kramer.
And we're all with the library, but we'll be talking about different aspects of research impact, different online tools, and things that you can do, ways you can think about your research. So I'll be starting, and then we'll just go on down the line. Because there are so few of you, ask it all the questions you want at any point. If there are aspects you want to delve into, I think that's fine. I think we'll have time. So, yeah, whatever you guys want to get out of this, I'm up for. So for maximizing research impact, I'm going to talk about 3 stages in the research process where you can make strategic decisions about your research to try and maximize your impact. So the first one is making strategic publication decisions where you're putting your research. The second one would be once it has been published, making sure that people are finding it. And then finally, how to track your impact and exposure at the end of the day for various decisions and files for action that many people inevitably need. So I'll start. And some quick notes before I start. Pretty much everything that I'm talking about, we have a research guide for research metrics, tinyurl.aumetrics. We also have a larger faculty research guide that will also be in here somewhere, I think. So those are some resources. But again,
I'm sorry, I can get rid of this one.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. Oh, is it on there too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I apologize, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, it's totally fine. And another quick note, whenever we talk about impact, it is always a really fuzzy concept. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So primarily what I'm going to be talking about is what we think of as more traditional scholarly impact. We'll talk a little bit outside of that narrower range. But that means depending on what your research discipline is, it can take a lot of different forms, right? So not one size fits all is, I guess, the best way to say this. All right, so strategic publication decisions. And the asterisk here, mostly we're going to be talking about journal articles. But I would love to talk about other types of research output that you guys may be creating or are interested in talking about. So who here has heard about journal impact or impact factor? Really? Oh boy, okay. So pretty much when we talk about journal impact, it's one of the main ways that people tend to be evaluated when it comes to scholarly publications, aka the prestige of the journal you're publishing in. So the main point in this whole first section is that it is something that you want to consider before you actually publish. So there are ways to look up what are considered the top journals in different disciplinary areas based on impact factor other journal metrics. So a quick introduction to how to find those. And just a note that there are 3 metrics. They all use different calculations, so they're not directly comparable to each other, but can all be ranked in a list, which is what I'll be showing.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I wanted to, since it's such a small audience, I was wondering if we could just know what your fields are, just so we have some sense of what the publication, what impacts, what things we would be looking at to help you.
Good idea.
Economics. So I work in TRTW, so I'm doing research on open educational resources.
Cool.
Economics, management.
Okay.
Philosophy.
All right. Mm-hmm.
CTRL, but also economics.
Okay.
HR management and organizational behavior.
Okay. Wow. So some themes in this, this crowd, which is good. We don't have to talk about science. One thing that I actually should talk about is that the impact factor was created for the sciences. So it's not surprising to me that, one, AU tends to be a social science heavy discipline school, but when it comes to measuring impact, it gets harder the further away from sciences you tend to get. Because this was created, and you can see actually looking at this that if you look at the categories, they're the most specific for the science categories. So this is neuroscience, I believe. And they have, if you look down here, separate categories for science and social science. What's missing? Arts and humanities. They don't even get categories in this particular way. So this has been the traditional method that people use to evaluate journals. Sorry, yeah, I know some of my slides are smaller than they should be, which is why I encourage you to follow up by looking at our PowerPoint later.
Sorry for the interruption. I brought 3 printouts of the slides, but only 3 because we have so many slides. But if you want one, you can grab one.
One of the canon.
But what this will do, if you can find a discipline that more or less matches, I can tell you there is management, there is economics, there are other business categories. So I think everyone in this room should be able to find a category that can more or less describe their discipline. It will create a ranked list. Oh, the scientist just walked in. It's okay, I'm a science librarian. I have no bias against science. It's just when you start talking about impact, it tends towards the sciences. This will be something that if you are tenure track, when you go for tenure, when you go for reappointment, anyone with scholarly expectations at this campus specifically, this is something that they'll pay attention to. So it behooves you to at least look at these impact factors. If you are, say, a graduate student and don't end up working here, that may change. But I can tell you, AU specifically has a little bit of a love relationship with impact factors. Yes?
Is that 32?
That is a 32. So something to know about impact factors. What it is essentially is average number of citations per article in that journal, roughly speaking. They vary wildly from discipline to discipline, which is again why I say there's a strong STEM bias here. STEM publishes way, way more often and cites way, way more often than social sciences does. So what is a good impact factor in number 1 in a science discipline is not going to be anywhere close to what you would see in philosophy.
I'm weird.
Yes. Yeah. But that's why we have these ranked lists, so that you can compare journals to each other within that same category, so that you're not comparing a neuroscience journal to a philosophy journal. But the point is, take a look at some point so that you're aware of how external evaluators might be looking at your discipline differently than you think of the journals in your discipline. Okay. Same concept, different metric. A lab called Simago creates SJR, or Simago Journal Rankings. That's incredibly redundant, I realize. The nice thing about this is that they are more social science focused. They index a lot more social science journals, and the categories tend to be a bit more specific when it comes to social science categories. So, especially if you end up publishing in a journal that doesn't have an impact factor, SJR can be a good option for you. But same thing, you can find ranked lists of different subject categories. And finally, Google always gets into the game with just about everything on Earth, so they have metrics of their own. They come with some pretty heavy limitations in that there's no historical rankings, and they will only rank the top 20 journals in any category. However, they have some excellent arts and humanities categories. I know no one here is in history, but they have like Asian history and British history. Like they break down the wide history category into 6 subgenres. So the reason why you might want to look at all 3 is that there might be a category that better describes your specific research than the others. That said, none of these are going to be super interdisciplinary. So if you're talking about like urban climate change and justice, you're not going to find a category for that. Okay. So questions about these journal rankings? Okay. Some other considerations. As you are thinking about where you should publish, who is it that you're trying to reach? Some journals will have a much smaller targeted audience, while some are designed to appeal to a broader audience. Usually the broader ones will have higher impact factor, but be strategic in where you're placing what information, because ultimately what you are trying to demonstrate is that you are impacting a wider audience, right? So maybe something that could have broader appeal, you aim for a broader journal with higher impact, that kind of thing. Sometimes we can't get journal metrics on any of those 3 resources I just talked about. Kind of the next step that people tend to look for is journal acceptance rates, or what percentage of the manuscripts that they receive do they end up publishing. So the lower the acceptance rate, the more prestigious the journal. There's only one database that tracks for some disciplines, which is Cabell's. Otherwise, you usually just have to ask the publisher. There's just no good standardization right now for journal acceptance rates. Also, just think about journal quality isn't the only measure that you'll be measured by. We'll talk more about that when we talk about tracking your impact at the end, but how your article itself is doing versus the journal matters. And then books. Is anyone planning on publishing books? Should I talk about books, I guess is the question. Okay, great. I'll just skip that. Most people have questions. Again, I tend to tailor this based on what I have kind of heard is included in the evaluation and what tends to be valued, but lots of disciplinary differences. All right, once you've published, how can we make sure that the people who might be citing it are reading and finding your work? Lots of different ways to do this.
We'll publish chapters in books, so it's a good idea to talk about books.
Okay, so I should talk about books. Let me go back. Usually the primary consideration for books is the publisher. Are they prestigious or not? And there is no metric for that. So good luck. There are more citations or more places that track book citations. Google Scholar is really the leader there when it comes to book citations and even book chapter citations. So you can get citations now, but demonstrating impact when it comes to books and book chapters tends to get fuzzier. Who is the editor? What's their background? For example, would be a consideration for a book chapter. Who else submitted chapters, right? That kind of thing. So that's when we start to move more from the quantitative to the qualitative impact, which is why I'm not talking about it as much, because they aren't necessarily metrics. But all part of this big scope. It's just hard to wrap your brain around it in a concrete way, the way you can with journal articles. But talk to me. And I think that's the point of my whole presentation, is that I'm here to help you guys with all of this, because there's a lot. And you shouldn't necessarily have to know all of this in order to be successful at your job. Okay, so ways to maximize exposure. Google Scholar profile. If you don't have one, I recommend setting one up. All you need is something that logs on to Google. It can be your personal Gmail. It can be something affiliated with American.edu that won't display on your Google Scholar profile. But it's a handy way to get all of your research in one place that you can control. So it says, we think you wrote the following publications. Tell us what you want to add to your profile. Okay? You can add and remove things at any point. But it will track citations for you. And say someone was interested in learning more about your work, right? They read an article, they thought it was groovy, they want to see what else you've done. This makes it really easy for people to find additional things that you've done. Open access. Has anyone heard about open access? Yay, okay. So Chris is going to talk a lot more about open access, so I'm just going to briefly talk about this. Actually, I have slides for all of this, so I'm actually just going to get into the slides. So here I already talked about it, but this is what a Google Scholar profile looks like. Open access is essentially when you are publishing so that there is no subscription required for someone to access your article. This is a great way to increase the exposure, right, of your work. And a lot of studies have actually demonstrated a correlation between open access and citation count. Again, Chris will talk more about that. There is sometimes a perception that publishing open access decreases the prestige of the journal, which isn't always the case, just that they tend to be newer. And they aren't going to be as well-known and entrenched in your discipline as traditional journals. There are tools available to evaluate the quality of open access journals, and that's something that we're well-equipped to help with as well. Again, Chris will talk about this more, but for this purpose, consider open access as a way of increasing your audience. Abstracting keywords. How are people going to find your research? What are they going to be searching for that will hit on your study, right? A lot of people use Google Scholar, use databases. One thing to think about is that it may be people in your field, it may be people who don't have a specific background in your research. So you want to use both jargon that is central to your field and also maybe some other ways to describe your work in ways that are appealing to broader audiences. And that will help it become discoverable. So that's essentially what all of this is. How would you describe your work in other words that people might use to find it? All right. And finally, once you've done all of that and it's time to prove your impact, how can we track your impact in various ways? And actually, this is something that both increases the exposure and helps you track. Again, Chris will talk more about scholarly networks. But is anyone on any one of these already? Yeah,
What are you
a
on?
couple nods, some nods. Sorry?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what are you on?
Research team.
Okay. Any others? Academia? SSRN. Oh, good. We've got almost the whole quadfecta. I don't know what 4 is. Trifecta, quadfecta. Anyway.
How about REPAC, since we've got economics people here? You know REPAC? R-E-P-E-C.
Ooh, well, that's one you should talk
That's a
about.
big one,
Yeah. So all these serve different audiences, different purposes. Usually what I recommend if you aren't sure which ones you maybe should engage in, look at people in your field, see where they are. Go where they are, because people do use this to find authors, studies, but also collaborators. So it's a good way to be seen in the scholarly community, and it gives you some nice metrics that you might not otherwise get. These are my pathetic metrics, but they will show the number of times people have downloaded articles on ResearchGate. It gives you something called an RG score, which is this little guy in red. It's kind of silly, but it's designed to be like a how much influence do you have in the ResearchGate universe kind of thing. So something to consider. Let's go back and talk about citation counts. These same 3 sources that gave us our journal prestige also track citation counts because they're using those citations to create their metrics, the journal metrics. So you can go in and get your citations from any of these 3 sources. Of the 3, Google Scholar tends to be the most inclusive, for better or for worse. You'll almost always have higher citation count in Google Scholar, but it can include things like online bibliographies, dissertations, white papers, things that some people might not consider a scholarly citation. So just something to keep in mind and why it might be worth going to more than one place to look at your citations. Okay. Some other things to consider. Has anyone heard of altmetrics? Oh boy, this is so exciting. So for a long time, the only way we measured impact was to look at citations. We've since realized that there are other metrics that we can look at that give clues as to who is engaging with your work. So the number of views and downloads in ResearchGate would be an example of that, right? It's not someone citing, but it is evidence that they've perhaps looked at your work or are interested in it. And there's a pretty wide variety of those metrics that we can track now, and they're kind of all generally called altmetrics. But starting with views, downloads, and usage counts, Web of Science, the same system that's shown here, has both citation counts and something called usage, which is every time someone clicks to download the full text or download the citation into citation software. And it's a good way, especially if you just published something 6 months ago, to say, I don't have any citations, but I have a usage count of like 53. Like people are engaging with it. And that's what a lot of this falls into. And there's also social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. There's a lot of debate about the role that this should play, because what is it actually measuring? Is it impact, or is it just vanity, right? Which I will mostly bypass for now, unless you guys really want to talk about that. But something to consider. So I'm going to show you the 2 main altmetrics sites that pull together a lot of these metrics. One is called Altmetric. It's available in a lot of different places. The easiest way to find it is to go to a journal article, and then they have a bookmarklet that you can just add to a browser, and it pulls this up. And it essentially tracks all different types of attention. The one that I really think is interesting is that they have started tracking policy documents. So at AU, that might be of particular interest if you think your work might be cited in policy. It is by no means comprehensive, Sometimes the only way to know that is just to have someone tell you that your work's been cited in policy or to be involved in the creation of the policy. But it's a start. The other thing that it does is start to compare your attention to other articles in the field. So for this one, you can see along the right-hand side, it's comparing it to other articles that were published around the same time in the same journal and how much attention they're getting. And this is number 9 out of over 3,800 articles.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How do faculty members describe altmetrics in their in their files?
I think the most common one would be downloads or views. And it would be something, again, if it's like a more recent article, that they would say, this is indirect evidence of impact, something like that. So it's I always think of it like additional evidence. It's not the thing that's going to get you tenure, but it's something that you can show instead of just having an article with a blank number. And the other one is available through one of our library databases, Scopus. It's something called PlumX, which was bought by Scopus/Elsevier. But it, again, provides a lot of different metrics. One of the nice things about this one is that they also own EBSCO, which is a big suite of databases. And so they can look at HTML and PDF views within those databases. And they're the only ones that can collect that. So, again, just different types of evidence. They also tend to do a much better job at book tracking if they index your book. All right, some other things. Stefan is going to talk a bit about ORCID. Does anyone know what ORCID is? All right, it's,
We should make ORCIDs today if we have time.
Okay. It's pretty much just a unique number identifier for you as a scholarly author that you can essentially tag all of your works, right? So if your name is Jane Smith, people might have trouble finding your articles, right? Or if you were misspelled, which happened to me, or if you change names, right? These are all things that make it harder for people to track your works. ORCID is designed to replace that. It's kind of like social security numbers for research. But Stefan will talk about it. And then finally, Impact Story is designed to be like an online CV supplement that showcases your altmetrics for different works. All right. And we can talk more about all of those. But my closing thoughts are, think about how can you provide evidence for what you're doing, right? I know it's something people hate thinking about along the way, but the earlier you start thinking about it, the better set up you'll be at the end of the day. Playing the game. Who is it that will be evaluating you, and what is it they want to see? And what does it look like in your discipline? Because that changes so much depending on the type of scholarly output and what the kind of the culture is there. All right. And then just some assistance and links that you can go back to later. But like I said, if you forget everything else, I'm the support person for all of the metric stuff on campus. So I think I've met with 6 people this summer just to talk about their third-year reviews. So I'm happy to meet with all of you and talk about all this stuff and help get you set up. All right. Yeah, questions? Okay, then we're going to do a little shuffle here.
Or just switch seats.
Yeah.
And if anybody came in later, these slides are all on the Blackboard site for this session.
Okay, again, my name is Chris, and I am the coordinator of the institutional repository that's part of the American University Digital Research Archive. And so I'll be talking about that in a minute. Wanted to begin, though, with a couple fun facts about the benefits of open access. Have any of you intentionally made work open access, like in academia or in SSR? All these do potentially have open access material in it. Do you know if you have any actual articles in there? Academia? Okay. So anyway, I wanted to tell you just quickly about two studies. This first one is actually just an estimate by NIH about PubMed Central users. Of a million unique users in a given year, this is all written here, in a given day, they estimate that 75% of them are coming from outside the academic community, meaning that they don't have any access to subscription databases. So this is just to let you know how it's benefiting people around the world. The second kind of major study, this is now 10 years old, but NSF commissioned a study where they looked at 1.2 million articles in 10 different areas over a 10-year period, just to look at how much more they were getting cited than just the non-open access articles. And they saw, depending on the field, between 36% to 172% more. Now, I even wonder if that's increased a lot since over the last 10 years, because open access has become much more known, and people are now kind of coming into various professions kind of internet-born, meaning that that the internet has been available throughout their careers, which I think older researchers don't necessarily fully fathom the value, how the internet makes their work that much more accessible.
So if it's on ResearchGate, for instance, is it considered open access?
Well, it is. If you put it up there yourself, yes, that's open access. Whether it's legal or not, it's that's a lot of work up there is not. They do also have links though to subscription databases, so it could appear at least like a page or like a slug, could appear. And then if you click on it, it's actually taking you, if you happen to be working at a place and has a subscription to that database, it looks like it's seamless, and they take you right to the article. So I wouldn't consider that open access. So then I wanted to mention a few of the challenges. Now, the most important one, or the most prominent one, is what I refer to as the publishers' cartel, which is they have, you all probably know about this, but it's a triple pay system where the institution, American University, pays for the content, we pay for the creation of the content, we pay for the peer reviewers, the salaries of the peer reviewers, which is among you, and then we also pay for the subscriptions themselves. So what they're getting out of it is, or what they're putting into it is editing, basically editing and distribution. But at this point, there's not even any printing anymore, and so it is those publishers, the 5 major academic publishers. They've all become multi-billion-dollar businesses, and they're all private. Like, their profit margins are as high as almost any company in the United States. And so so open access definitely poses a threat to them. So various ways that they have been fighting it. Now, I am not, it's just a fact of life that these publishers, that people have to publish in these publications. It's primarily what administrators regard as legitimate. I mean, as they're the ones with the impact factors, and they're the ones that are best known. And so deans and rank and tenure committees definitely have a bias towards all these kinds of publications. But whether it's open access or not, as Rachel was saying, it's probably more of a perception that open access would somehow take away from the value of a given journal. So the various ways that they are pushing back against open access include there are these things called article processing fees. So if you wanted to go to an Elsevier journal and make your article open access, many of their journals are what are called hybrid journals, where you can publish it without paying anything. They'll publish it, but then it becomes a paywalled article where the only way to get to it is if you happen to be at a university that subscribes to it. They do have an option, though, but this is really a way just to make you not want to do it, where you can pay to make your article open access, but it's expensive. And so it can be, on average, it's about $1,800, and it can be up over $5,000. I will mention in a few minutes about what we're doing to try to help you with that. The second is they lobby Congress against. The law is that the current laws are that if you get federal funding, that the work has to be made open access. So there is lobbying against that kind of thing. They will also. There's been a real trend among universities to mandate that you deposit into institutional repositories. And the way that they have fought that, and I'm not sure if this is happening as much as it was just a few years ago, but some of these publishers have come out with rules saying if you put it if your university has a mandate, then you can't put it in. If they don't have a mandate, then you can put it into your personal website or into the institutional repository. Another one is the copyright transfer agreement, which if any of you have published anything, that's what you have to sign, pretty much to basically sign over your copyright. Sometimes it's for a limited amount of time. Sometimes it's in perpetuity. So there are, in fact, we've got this on, we've got a copyright subject guide. There is an author's addendum that you can use to attach, to be able to potentially negotiate that, turning over that copyright for an extended period of time. And then the last one I have listed here is what Elsevier has been doing. Now this is kind of funny. It's like if you can't fight them, join them. But what they have done is they bought SSRN recently, which you may have known about a year ago. And then just recently they bought this company called B Press that has this thing called Digital Commons. That is it's a major provider platform for institutional repositories. And what their intentions are, behind this, I have to wonder. It's hard to say, but it does seem like if they fought against it for so long, and now they're kind of trying to control the market in a better way. And hard to say what that's going to mean for the author. The other big challenge is just the time it takes to do. And so for a professor or for a TA, they're taking time away from doing something else that they would probably rather be doing. And so it's a substantial, it could be a substantial amount of time, and it's definitely something that it doesn't seem to be like an immediate reward, for doing it. And so that's part of how we've done the planning for our institutional repository, bearing in mind that that's a burden on you. So let's just say you have a paper and you want to make it available. So what are the options? The first two are the publishing options, and these the open access movement, they've come up with. I'm not even sure who came up with this originally, but it's a kind of a color system just to kind of describe the different tiers of open access. And so for publishing, there was you might hear of yellow, green, white, blue, and then the top was gold, and gold was open access publishers themselves. The other ones were archiving options, which I'll get to in a second. So gold then encompasses the publishers that basically just have open publishing, that where you can pay, such as a hybrid like what I described. And then since then, the people that are really into open access publishing were saying, well, that's really not even that good, because you have to pay this big upfront fee. So they've come up with another one now that's called Diamond, and it's called that because it's better than gold, even though it's not a color. And that is where you don't have to pay anything, and you can put into, submit to hopefully a higher impact journal. So even though that's become like kind of a new category, it still accounts for, especially in humanities, about 70% of the total scholarly publication are journals that don't charge anything. So, okay, if you want to publish in a hybrid journal, the library has a grant that we have established in the past couple of years where we will pay up to, actually I said a hybrid, it's not in a hybrid journal. It has to be in a purely open access journal, but one that charges article processing charges, where we will grant up to $3,000 per article. So this would include PLOS, the PLOS journals, Public Library of Science. What else? Did you have some other good examples?
That's the really well-known one.
That's the most, yeah. Well, I don't know if PLOS do they have anything for anything outside of the sciences? No.
Most disciplines will have open access options, but a lot of them will charge article processing charges because they still need to fund their journal. So if you want open access but don't have the money to pay for it, we can help, as long as it's not a subscription journal.
Yeah. So everybody following this? the choice between a hybrid and a not and a just a straight open access journal.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
just that because
Okay.
it's a way for you to pay.
Right.
Right. Well, our hope is there's like a 2020 flip that we want to like flip so that most journals don't have a subscription, and that libraries can be supporting primarily article processing charges instead of paying these exorbitant subscription rates. But
So how do journals like PLOS make money?
I believe they started with a pretty large grant, if I remember correctly.
With you said
PLOS.
PLOS.
Yeah. How do they make
Yeah.
money?
Oh, they charge article processing charges.
Oh,
for
they
one.
do too?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they're 100%. They have no hybrid option. If you publish with them, it's open access, but you have to pay. And so
$1,800
Yeah. Yeah.
for PLOS One, which I
So
submitted to.
is there like an alternative to if you do research and the fact is you just have to pay if you want people to see it at all? Like, is there any alternative to like publishing with people that are going to charge you one way or the other?
So he was talking about Diamond OA, which is ones that are
Okay.
like supported by societies, for example.
Yeah.
Or usually it's lower impact disciplines like library science
Right.
that don't charge you.
You're right. It's
Anywhere.
Societies. There are various. Sometimes publishers will just have have some because they don't because they may have foundation money or they may have some other kind of grant that where somebody wants to have that kind of work published. That's what I think. Honestly, I think I see a lot. Could be a university publisher. Okay. So anyway, the next part is actually sharing options, and that is, this is really almost post-publication or things that don't necessarily get published. So green open access is the top of that, and so that is green open access. Most typically is for preprints and that are put into some kind of repository, whether it's an institutional repository or a subject repository such as SSRN or REPEC. So let's see, just curiosity. Does anybody know what a preprint is? Because I've found that a lot of people don't know that, even though it's used very commonly. That's pretty much it's what you submit to the publisher before it's published, before it's been edited. Even after it's been edited and they send it back to you for like a proof, if it's not the publisher PDF, we can put it in, and we can put it in as soon as basically as soon as it's published. And so if you're doing that, hang on to those. Once it's published, don't delete anything in the past, or don't put it away in some place where you can't find it, because we want to add it to make it openly accessible, assuming that you want to also. The other thing is personal and department web pages or social scholarly networks, such as ResearchGate and academia.edu. Those you kind of need to be cautious about copyright, and so I'm going to mention that in a second. So let's if I could, let me just go ahead and show you. Oopsie daisy, how do I do this?
Left.
I went too far.
Alt tab.
All right.
Nope. Nope.
Backwards.
This one. Usually the left arrow does it.
This?
Done.
Oh, there you go. Uh-oh.
No, we're
I'm
just stuck.
stuck.
There's no going back
Well,
now.
hold on. I can find something.
Yeah, that works.
So let's just say, DRA, Digital Research Archive at American or .American .edu. And we're going to change this so there's going to be a second way to do this. If you remember AUDRA and not DRA, then you're going to be able to get to it from that. So this is the main site. And what Digital Research Archive is, it's a combination of institutional repository but also special collections. And so the institutional repository portion is under here. And so among the things that these are all openly accessible. Among the things that we archive include course syllabi, but it's up to you to submit them. We don't have an automatic way for doing that. And then, okay. And then there's a section of faculty research. So currently we have something from 204 faculty members on campus, but we welcome your work as well. And just to give you an example of, I'll give you this, Pat Aufderheide teaches in the School of Communications, and we have a lot of stuff from her, and so this is a good example. She started off as a journalist, and she was a film and video journalist, and wrote a lot of reviews for places like the Chicago Reader and things going way back into the late 60s. And so she has given us even print articles that, from sources that are out of release or that they're not available otherwise electronically through databases. And so we've scanned those, and so we can scan and we can include. But so when we do a scan, we can also do what's called optical OCR, which makes the whole thing readable. So you scan it, you run it through that, then it becomes full text searchable. If it gets added into the institutional repository, Google or whatever search engines will make it full text searchable, which makes it a lot easier because that means the records, the metadata that we provide does not need to be so extensive that you wouldn't be able to find something. So to give you an example, let's click on something. So this is the records we provide, because we're putting in a lot, are pretty simple. But on each record, you can see the download or the viewed statistics. So in this case, so you can view it without downloading it, I think. A lot of times, though, the views are, I think, from from search engine crawlers. So anyway. So one other, thing that we've added, there are some professors who want to put stuff in, but they have no preprints available, and they don't have most of what they have. They had illegal uploads that they were putting into various other sites. But when I started to look at them to see if we could actually mirror them, I could see that they were all copyrighted. They were from from publishers, and so there is something else that we can do, and I'm not sure if I can give a good example, but where we can actually put a record in there that is a linked record that will actually take you to a subscription database. It's not preferred, but it is. If you wanted to make it so a student or so a colleague could just browse what you've published, we could put it all into one place here, and so this would include the paywall articles as well. You understand? So it's kind of, most of this kind of stuff is going to be discovered from Google searches, from web searches. It's not going to be from people actually coming to our site and browsing it. But if that's, but once they get there, it's kind of nice to be able to have them be able to see a variety of your work. All right. Any questions about this before I move?
We're a little low on time.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'm going to go quickly. Yeah. So copyright concerns, I will speed up a lot. So if you submit something to me, I will review it. I'll vet it for copyright. If I have any questions about it, if it looks like it's something that's already copyrighted that we really shouldn't be putting up, I'll get back to you. I'll ask you if you have a preprint, and we'll try to come up with some way. The worst case scenario is I'll put one of those linked records. There is a website called Sherpa Romeo that I'm not going to go to right here, but that does include publishers' policies, whether they allow archiving, what kind of archiving they allow. Sometimes, once in a while, it will say it's okay to actually put a PDF of their article, of their version of it, right into your repository. Okay, so the services we offer are basically uploading. We do all the cataloging. We'll do file transfers. We will do the copyright vetting. Pretty much everything. I think we've kind of been over embargoes. If you submit something and you don't want it to be available for a while, because this is especially with dissertations, because you don't want your research to be scooped or because you want to have a chance to publish it, we can put something in and just make it go live 2 years later, automatically. Advantages. Ours is pretty much, it is a permanent repository. So anything that comes in here should be available in perpetuity. Should be. Let's hope. Let's see. It definitely will be crawled by Google Scholar. There's a thing called Microsoft Academic Search, one called Base Search. these are some similar. There's an open access button that you may know about that you can. It's an add-on you can put into Google Chrome. Everything should be more easily discoverable through that. ResearchGate will also comb our site looking for articles. Okay, self-submission. This is actually technically possible at this point, but it's a little clunky. And so it's like if you want to put stuff in, send it to me and I'll put it in for you. So getting started, if you're interested, we do have a research deposit form, easily found searching the university website just on the term research deposit, and you'll find the form. There's also a link to it on the front page of Blackboard, and there is also on the front page of Blackboard, this is the universal front page, is a syllabus deposit form as well. If you want to send me your Vita, we're happy to look through it to see if we can find stuff that's already published that is open access. That's a little time consuming, but since we have a small audience today, I would definitely give you a high priority, going into this semester. Then also, okay, let's see, one other thing. So we've kind of touched on disciplinary repositories, totally in favor of them. If you put them in there, you can also put them in ours. This just helps your coverage, I think. It also will help your discoverability. Some of the better knowns, these have been mentioned, SSRN archive, and you can see the various subject areas that they cover. REPEC it's one of the older ones, and that's economics, and it's got 1.2 million articles. Figshare is a place for storing for data collection. So let's see. This is just quickly about putting it in AUDRA versus putting it on the university website, on your personal website or department webpage. If you do it, my suggestion is to put it into AUDRA and then just make a link to it, so it's permanently there. Because if you put it onto your departmental page and then you leave the university, who's to say if it'll stay on there? Likely it won't. ResearchGate and academia.edu, they are social network sites. They are good for sharing your current research. Do not make any promises about being permanent repositories, though. And so that's why if you put something in here, not to I'm not going to lobby against it, but just to be aware that it's really not necessarily a permanent place. And so just to if you put something in, we will also go in and look just to see if there's stuff in there that we don't have and be in touch with you about it. So these are just various pros and cons about it. Anyway, so that's my information. C. Lewis, and if you have any questions, I'm also the copyright contact person for anything that might come up in publishing or use in class, and use of other people's materials in class. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to work with them.
Oh, you see where you're going to switch? Okay.
So, at the end of the show, I will talk about two very specific tools, if you will, which are persistence identifiers for you and for your research outputs. And by research outputs, that can be publications, data sets, slideshows, videos, what have you. So I'll start by this idea of a scholarly ecosystem at the center of which is the researcher. That would be you. And you may produce in the course of your research, if you're doing empirical research, data sets, which everybody knows are stored on 3.5-inch floppies. Sorry for the old clip art there. And presumably produce publications, journal articles, book chapters, what have you. Then you work for a university, in this case AU, and you may receive external funding from research funders, federal agencies, private foundations, what have you. And all of these entities are linked together in various ways, and questions are asked of each other, if you will. So the university, in this case AU, would ask, what have you, the researcher, published? Because they care, the employer, in this case, cares about your scholarly productivity, if you will, for promotion and for tenure review. And the university hopefully might ask itself, what can the university do to accommodate your research output? Data sets, publications, etc. The funding agency would like to know what publications and data sets have been generated by that research that we have funded. We would like to know, we put out a couple of $100 million a year if we're a federal agency, what comes out of it? The researcher herself or himself would like to know, how can I or others easily list and cite the publications, the data sets, and the funding sources that I have produced or received? And then others looking at this from the outside might want to ask, if I have found a publication of you somehow or other, how can I find out if there's a data set behind the publication, that what led to these published findings? Or if they first found the data set, then they would like to know perhaps where is the publication that was based on that data set. And so all of these questions can be more easily answered by two types of persistent, unique identifiers. And in particular, we're talking here about ORCID for the researcher, the human being, and DOIs for their research outputs. That could be, again, publications, data sets, but also presentations, videos, really any form of research output. So let me first talk about the reason behind the development of ORCID, which dates back now to about 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's actually fairly recent. And the underlying problem here is the ambiguity of names for identifying researchers and their works. So a typical bibliography or list of references in a fairly typical format like APA style looks something like that. So you have people identified by last name and first initial. Now when you look at that, you could ask, how can you know whether these people, Langston, Lindsay, Cummings, Johnson, etc., are the same person or another person if you see that same name somewhere else again? Because there could be many Langston, M's. Or is this Lindsay E.B. the same person as the person somewhere else identified as just Lindsay E.? Different form of the name, but maybe it's the same person, maybe it's not. What happens if the author changes their name, for instance, due to marriage, changes the last name, and there's the citation chain is broken because it's the same person with a different name? What if the author uses different character sets for their name, if they publish in different languages or even in different character sets, Chinese, Arabic, Cyrillic, what have you? And so from these examples you can see that linking researchers to their publications just by name is a very uncertain proposal, and yet that's how it's been done for centuries, if you will, until this idea of ORCID came about. Now I should say ORCID is not an entirely new idea. Before that there have been identifier numbers for researchers produced by publishers, but there is one important difference. So ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. What's noteworthy here, the C, contributor, means it's not just for the PI of a research project, it can also be for a graduate student who assists the researcher with cleaning up a data set or with formatting the manuscript or what have you, so a contributor to research. And the other important term here is the open. So there have been other schemes of giving researchers numbers, but in that case, the number, in a sense, was owned by the publisher who invented that scheme. With ORCID, ORCID is a non-profit organization. Fun fact, it's headquartered in Bethesda, right near that Democracy Boulevard Mall. It's actually it's sort of an obscure little office that's just there. But the address is Motor City Way or something like that in Bethesda. So that's the headquarters. But it's a non-profit organization, and open means that you own your ORCID ID. It's not owned by a publisher. It's not owned by a software company or a Google or a Microsoft or an Elsevier. It's not owned by American University. It's yours once you establish it. It's not controlled by anybody else but you. So it's yours for life, if you will. We have a subject guide on ORCIDs, which has a little video that's over about 4 minutes long, and the describes all that in some animation. I'm not going to play that right now, but you can go here to watch that or point your colleagues to watch it. And so in a nutshell, what it does, as I mentioned, it provides a numeric identifier that distinguishes you as a researcher from other people who may have the same name, or that stays with you if you change your name. But it also has the potential, and it's actually already being used for that, to connect workflows such as manuscript and grant submissions. So this is also being used by funding agencies and by publishers. And I myself encountered the benefit of that once a little while ago. I was asked to review an article. I went to the publisher's website, to the reviewing platform, and asked, do you have an ORCID? So normally I would have to fill out this long form with my name and my affiliation and my job title and what have you. But they asked, do you have an ORCID identifier? I said, yes, enter your ORCID identifier. So I did that, and then it pulled all that information out of my ORCID record. So I didn't have to enter it again, which can be an enormous time saver. And you can register for an ORCID at that URL right there. And it's very basic. All you need to put in is your name and email address, and that takes altogether a couple of minutes. But it's best if you also add publications, funding sources, etc., which shows somebody else more clearly what have you done. Are you the person who published these things? And most importantly, some other systems can import and export between your ORCID record and their systems. So for example, one thing we're working towards, I say towards, we're not nearly there yet, is to potentially link FARS and ORCID. So if you laboriously enter your stuff into FARS at the end of each year, maybe you don't have to do that again. You can pull from ORCID, or can be pushed to ORCID. So it's not just sort of a dark hole as far as it is now of information about your research activities. So I'll show you one example of an AU faculty member's ORCID record. This is Matt Harding's. So here you can see this is his ORCID ID. He has links, which that's a good idea to do, to other websites about himself. And he lists his education, where he's currently employed, which is here, and then his works. And some of these things you don't have to enter by hand. They can be linked from other systems, like ResearchGate, for example. You don't even have to necessarily enter this information yourself. It can be pulled from various other systems. I won't get into the details right now. You can see all that information here at this guide to ORCID. Before I move on to the other kind of identifier, DOIs, are there any questions or comments about the ORCID?
I have one quick comment, and that is I have an ORCID, and everybody just takes a second, is what he described. So what I do is on my email signature, I just include my ORCID, which is all just one little simple little line, and that way, if somebody just wants to click on it just to see my publications, that's a quick way to see it. It takes up no space.
I think it's also worth noting that increasingly grant funders are asking for ORCIDs. So.
And AU requires them for PhD students.
Oh, okay.
That's true. Yeah. The ProQuest, the company that archives our dissertations, they require them to have one. In Portugal, for example, entire countries are now picking this up. In Portugal, every researcher has to have one. The whole infrastructure of research relies on that, the whole country. As of now, there are something like over 3 million ORCID IDs. And what's a little bit confusing is this is like ATM machine. The M in ATM means machine, and yet people say ATM machine. ORCID is somewhat similar. The ID stands for identifier, but people got confused, so they're now actually ORCID itself, the company says ORCID ID, although that's somewhat redundant. But that's how it goes. All right, let me move on to the other kind of persistent identifier, the digital object identifier. Raise your hand if you know you've seen that somewhere before. Okay, you will have seen that on journal articles. And that was what was developed for in the late 90s to early 2000s to put a unique, distinguishing permanent, persistent identifier on journal articles. And so examples are, here are two examples. One is for an article, and you often see that twice. Once you'll see it on the landing page on a publisher's website. There is that DOI for that article, and then you'll see it again somewhere in the article itself if you download it. And here's an example for a data set. This is one at ICPSR. And down here you see here's the DOI for that data set. And now, so the key to keeping this whole persistency of DOIs working is that the outfit that created the DOI needs to maintain it. In this case, ICPSR created this DOI for this data set. If they rearrange the whole website so this data set does not reside at that URL anymore, at that address, it is their responsibility to change the DOI so it goes to wherever they have moved it to, which means that the DOI remains stable as a method of citing that data set by other people. And it doesn't matter what ICPSR does with their website. That is the persistent address for that data set. So how do you get that? Well, one method is by publishing one of the many journals or data repositories that assign a DOI to your work. And if you do that, a publisher will do that automatically. That's not something you have to tell them to do. And the other method is by putting work into the AU Digital Research Archive, and Chris already mentioned the faculty deposit form that we have for that, which is that one. So we will put, we can assign DOIs for your work in the Digital Research Archive. Now we wouldn't do that if a publisher has already assigned a DOI to that very same article. The same thing is not supposed to have two different DOIs. But for preprints, for data sets, etc., we will do that. So here's an example of a faculty data set in the Digital Research Archive, and it has two links, one with a researcher's ORCID and then the DOI for that data set. Let's go there, and this is by David Vine. And so if somebody has found this data set, they can now go to David Vine's ORCID and see, because he has listed his works there, what else has he created or published. So they find that from the data set. Here are his works listed. You can see the sources how he pulled those in here. In this case from Researcher ID, in this case from Scopus. Excuse me. And then here's the DOI, and if all works as it should, then this will immediately redirect to the URL that's up here. And that's the whole idea of it. And you also notice the DOI is often a much shorter than the URL for any kind of digital thing on the internet, because this is not a very pretty URL. It's even got a funny comma and percent sign in it. And lastly, this has nothing to do with DOIs or ORCIDs per se, but in the digital repository here we can also link out to something else. So in this case, this is the book that has used this data set as one underlying piece of evidence, if you will. So people who find the data set can find the book and buy the book. And lastly, down here we see this happens to be, in the last 3 months, this is the most frequently viewed and downloaded item in the whole repository. So this has been viewed almost 6,000 times.
Wow.
Okay. And here, I won't belabor this. You can look at that if you download a slideshow. This is a model of the life cycle of research data, which goes through various stages from conceptualization at the beginning to archiving in AUDRA or somewhere else at the end. The important piece here is for the discovery of research data or for publications, there has to be good metadata that can be picked up by the search engines to make that findable. And Rachel mentioned earlier keywords and abstracts. If you write an abstract for a data set or for a presentation or anything else with good keywords, that makes it much more likely that that will be picked up by search engines than if it's not there. If it just has an obscure title, like a painting, data set untitled number 55, and that's all you give it, then there's nothing for a search engine to index and to other people to search it by, and that is an important element. And so in AUDRA we also have ways, and we do that to catalog, as Chris mentioned, and describe whatever you put in there so search engines can pick that up. And that's it for DOIs and ORCIDs.
Can I add a couple of points about DOIs?
By all means.
One is, if anyone's familiar with academic analytics, it's a major metrics tool that's being used on our campus, and they track publications by DOI. So if your work has a DOI, it's going to end up in the academic analytics. It's how they're evaluating departments and schools. It's something the provost office keeps track of. So DOIs are important. And the other thing is all of the altmetrics stuff that I showed primarily uses DOI to track the intention and engagement. So adding DOIs to things like data sets makes it so that you can then discover who's sharing it with other people.
Can I also say one last thing, and that is, I think it's that we want to make it clear that we're, emphatically clear that we want you to succeed at doing this, and so we're happy to do whatever, because we know that it's very, technology changes fast, humans change slow, so we are happy to have to, hold your hand and bring you along if you want to delve into this.
This is literally what we get paid to do.
Yeah.
That's what I always tell our students, but it's applicable to you guys too. So use us.
And to end on a maybe slightly almost cynical note, if it has a DOI, it looks scholarly, and therefore,
Oh yeah, makes you look better.
Yeah,
That's true.
You put a DOI,
Even
you
blog
put something
entries.
somewhere that gets a DOI. This is like first order research output stuff, just like a journal article. That's how it works.
They're experimenting with like book chapters and DOIs now too.
Yeah.
I hope they do more of that because it makes it trackable.
So that concludes the presentation that we have, and we're open to any questions. We still have 4 minutes to go if you have any.
Any
more
questions?
comments.
Sorry, it's a lot to process. I know.
Yeah. One thing I skimmed over with the repository is it's not just articles. We, white papers, presentations, podcasts, blog entries. I don't know what else. Working papers. There's anything that almost anything that you produce, creatively produce, we can find a way to put it in there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for
Thanks,
coming.
guys.